Imagine standing on the edge of a swamp at dusk, where the air hangs heavy with mist and the still water hides countless secrets. The deep croak of bullfrogs echoes across the marsh, and every so often you hear the slow ripple of something large gliding beneath the surface. For centuries, these wetlands of Florida and Louisiana have held stories, some of them breathtakingly beautiful, others far more unsettling. Among the darkest is a legend that has haunted the American South for over 100 years. The tale of gator bait. This story speaks of a time in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when fear and prejudice shaped everyday life. It is said that alligator hunters, eager for the valuable leather hidden beneath the reptiles' thick hides, would use a shocking method to draw the animals from their hiding places. According to whispers passed down through generations, black children were allegedly placed near the water's edge as living lures to attract the hungry beasts. The very idea is chilling, a nightmarish image that still sends a shiver down the spine. But what makes this legend so powerful is not just its horror, is the way it exposes the harsh reality of an era when human dignity was often denied. Whether or not every detail of the tale is fact, it reflects a time when racial injustice was not merely an undercurrent but the very tide of society. Newspapers, postcards, and even children's songs from the early 1900s carried cruel jokes and images that turned human suffering into entertainment. To many, this story is a symbol of the dehumanization that defined the Jim Crow South, where systemic racism was woven into laws, traditions, and everyday life. As we uncover the roots of this unsettling narrative, we step back into a world where myths and truth blur, forcing us to confront uncomfortable questions. How much of this story is folklore? How much is history? And why does it still matter today? Join us as we journey through historical records, explore the culture of the time, and reveal how a single story can illuminate the larger struggle for justice and human rights. By understanding the past, both its documented facts and its haunting legends, we give voice to those who were silenced and ensure that the lessons of history are not forgotten. If this kind of deep exploration into untold history resonates with you, we invite you to support our channel. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications, so you will be among the first to uncover more hidden chapters of our shared past. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful stories to light and keeps the conversation about justice, memory, and truth alive for generations to come. Decades after the whispers of the gator bait legend first spread across the swamps and river banks of the American South, its shadow continued to linger in ways few people recognized. Time had softened the echoes of the story, and for many, it had faded into the hazy distance of folklore and rumor. Yet even legends have a way of slipping quietly into the symbols of everyday life, hidden in plain sight, until someone looks closely enough to see their darker origins. That is exactly what happened in 2020 at the University of Florida, a place where football Saturdays are a near-religious experience, and the sound of thousands of voices chanting together has long been a source of pride and unity. For years, the crowd would roar with a popular cheer known simply as gator bait, a rallying cry meant to celebrate the school's fearsome mascot and intimidate opposing teams. The phrase was fun, catchy, and to most people, nothing more than a spirited nod to the alligators that prowl the state's wetlands. But then history caught up with the cheer, and what once seemed like harmless sports tradition began to reveal the weight of an older and far more troubling story. As the nation reckoned with long-buried truths about race and the painful legacies of its past, students, alumni, and historians began to draw attention to the disturbing connection between those two words and the legend of black children being used as bait for alligator hunters more than a century ago. For generations, postcards, popular songs, and crude jokes had turned the image of black children as gator bait into a cruel caricature. Although no one on the football field in Gainesville had intended to invoke that history, The phrase itself carried echoes of a time when dehumanization was not only common but accepted. In the heat of national conversations about equality and the responsibility to confront uncomfortable truths, the cheer took on a meaning few could ignore. The University of Florida faced a choice that was larger than a single tradition. It was a moment that forced the institution to consider how symbols, even those adopted with innocent intentions, can bear the hidden weight of history. In June 2020, amid widespread calls for reflection and change across the country, the university announced that it would retire the gator bait cheer. The decision was not made to erase history, but to acknowledge it, to recognize that the words, when spoken without awareness, could reopen wounds for communities whose ancestors once suffered under the very images those words evoke. The announcement sparked debate, as such decisions often do. Some longtime fans questioned why a phrase that had been part of the game day experience for decades should suddenly be set aside. Others argued that the cheer itself had never been meant as an insult, and that its meaning on campus was completely separate from the old legend. Yet the deeper truth, as historians and community leaders explained, was that intent does not always erase impact. When a symbol is tied, however loosely, to a history of humiliation and violence, keeping it alive without acknowledgement risks perpetuating harm, even when that harm is unintentional. By removing the chant, the university did something more powerful than simply changing a tradition. It invited the community to confront the complicated layers of the past, and to consider how language and imagery can carry echoes of cruelty long after their original context has faded. In doing, it transformed an ordinary game day ritual into an opportunity for learning and remembrance. The decision became a living reminder that history is not something locked away in dusty archives. It flows through the present, shaping the words we speak and the customs we keep, even when we are unaware of it. The story of the Gator Bait Cheer's retirement is more than a footnote in the history of college sports. It is a modern chapter in the ongoing struggle to reconcile a nation's cherished traditions with the need to honor the dignity of all its people. It illustrates how myths from the 19th century can resurface in the 21st, not as deliberate insults but as quiet inheritances of a time when cruelty was normalized. By choosing to act, the University of Florida acknowledged that facing history, no matter how painful or ambiguous, requires courage and humility. And so the swamp-souled whispers found their way into a modern arena, where thousands once shouted without realizing the story hidden beneath their words. The legend that began in the murky waters of Florida's marshes had traveled through postcards and popular culture, into chants of school pride, and finally back into the public consciousness. What began as a simple cheer became a lesson in how the past lives on, urging us to listen more carefully to the echoes of history. In the end, the decision to retire those two words was not about silencing joy or rewriting the past. It was about ensuring that the traditions we pass on to future generations reflect the respect and understanding that every community deserves. Long before the University of Florida's decision to retire the Gator Bait chant, before stadiums filled with the roar of thousands of fans, the word gator carried a very different meaning in the deep wetlands of the American South. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the swamps of Florida and Louisiana were not places of sport or spectacle, but a frontier of survival and profit. These were lands where mist clung to the surface of black water, where the humid air carried the slow creak of cypress trees and the sudden splash of a powerful tail breaking the stillness. Beneath the surface, alligators lurked, creatures as ancient as the land itself, armored with thick, prehistoric scales and a jaw that could crush bone in an instant. To the hunters who braved these shadowed waters, the alligator was more than a fearsome animal. It was a living treasure chest. By the late 1800s, the world beyond the swamp had discovered a growing appetite for luxury goods, and few things symbolized wealth and refinement quite like alligator leather. Its texture was strong yet supple, its distinctive pattern immediately recognizable, and its rarity only heightened its allure. High society in the United States and Europe clamored for handbags, shoes, belts, and watch straps made from the gleaming hides of these wild reptiles. For merchants and craftsmen, the demand seemed endless, and for those willing to risk the dangers of the swamp, the promise of profit was irresistible. The alligator became not just a creature of the wild but a commodity, and the hunt for its skin grew into a booming trade that transformed the backwaters into a marketplace of ambition and danger. Hunters knew that the alligator's strength was matched by its cunning. These creatures could vanish beneath the water's surface, leaving only a ripple to mark their presence. To capture one required more than bravery. It demanded strategy and patience. Hunters experimented with all kinds of techniques, seeking the perfect lure to draw the animals from the depths. Some used chunks of meat or the carcasses of smaller animals, while others crafted elaborate decoys that mimicked the movements of prey. The pursuit became almost an art, a dangerous dance between human ingenuity and the raw power of nature. But as stories of the swamp grew, so too did the darker legends of what some claimed hunters would do when ordinary bait failed. It was in this climate of opportunity and peril that the rumor of gator bait began to take shape. As the market for alligator skins flourished, whispers spread that certain hunters in the most remote corners of the South resorted to unthinkable methods to guarantee a catch. The legend told of children, specifically black children, being placed near the water's edge to tempt the giant reptiles. Whether rooted in fact or cruel folklore, the story struck a chord that resonated far beyond the swamps. Newspapers and postcards of the early 1900s carried grotesque caricatures that turned the very idea into a form of entertainment, reinforcing the era's culture of dehumanization and racial prejudice. The booming leather trade and the myth it inspired were inseparable threads of a larger tapestry of exploitation. The wealth generated by the sale of alligator skins came at the cost of relentless hunting that threatened the species itself, while the legend of gator bait revealed a society willing to turn human suffering, real or imagined, into a spectacle. Even if historians debate whether the practice truly occurred, the fact that the story circulated so widely, repeated in songs, poems, and children's rhymes, reveals how deeply it tapped into the prejudices of the time. It reflected a world where the lives of black children could be joked about, where cruel images could be sold as novelties, and where economic ambition often walked hand in hand with moral blindness. This economic backdrop explains why the phrase gator bait, when later adopted as a sports cheer, carried a hidden weight that few recognized. What began as the dangerous but profitable business of hunting alligators for their prized hides eventually fed into a cultural narrative that outlived the trade itself. The leather goods may have been sold in the parlors of the wealthy, but the stories born in the swamps seeped into popular culture, creating a legacy that endured long after the last hides were tanned and stitched into luxury handbags. When the University of Florida decided in 2020 to retire the gator bait cheer, it was not merely reacting to a passing controversy, but unwittingly closing a circle that had begun generations earlier. The very words that once drew applause in a football stadium were tied, however indirectly, to a period when profit and prejudice combined to produce one of the South's most haunting legends. The alligator hunters of the 19th century could never have imagined that their quest for valuable skins would echo into the 21st century as a cautionary tale. Yet the connection remains a powerful reminder of how economic ambition can leave behind stories that shape the culture long after the trade itself has vanished. To trace the path from the murky swamps, where hunters risked their lives for a single hide, to the crowded stands of a modern university, is to witness the strange and often unsettling way history lingers. The legend of gator bait is not simply about the pursuit of luxury or the danger of the hunt. It is about how human choice is driven by profit, shaped by prejudice, and recorded in rumor can leave behind symbols that demand reflection long after their original context is gone. In the shimmering leather of an alligator handbag and the echo of a cheer shouted in unison, the past continues to speak, urging us to listen carefully to the lessons hidden beneath the surface. While the alligator hunters stalked the swamps and the trade in skins filled the parlors of the wealthy, another, Far more insidious commerce flourished above the waterline. It did not trade in leather or hides, but in words and images cheap to produce and easy to spread, yet capable of shaping the way entire communities saw their neighbors. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, newspapers, postcards, and souvenirs became the messengers of a cruel mythology, carrying into parlors and post offices a caricature so persistent that it blurred the lines between folklore and reality. The legend of children used as bait for alligators, whispered at first in the humid shadows of the bayou, began to travel far beyond the swamp. It leapt onto the printed page and into the mailbags of the world, transformed into entertainment for those who would never wade through a Florida marsh or hear the hiss of a reptile sliding through dark water. These images did not arrive in the polished language of academic history, nor did they carry the solemn weight of documentary evidence. Instead, they appeared as jokes, as novelty postcards to be passed around at parties or pinned above a mantel. A single illustration might show a wide-eyed child perched dangerously close to the gaping jaws of an alligator, with a sly caption meant to provoke laughter rather than outrage. Newspaper sketches, often accompanied by mocking rhymes, presented the legend as if it were a simple curiosity of the exotic South, turning the lives of vulnerable children into punchlines. What had once been whispered rumor was now sold for pennies and sent across the country, each piece of memorabilia reinforcing the notion that such cruelty was not only believable but amusing. For the people buying these postcards and reading these headlines, the swamp was a distant and mysterious place, a world of dark waters and hidden beasts. The very idea of alligators snapping at the shore carried a thrilling danger, and in the popular imagination, the supposed bait became part of that spectacle. The cruel suggestion of a child standing in harm's way became entertainment, a symbol of the untamed wilderness and the people the broader society chose to view as outsiders. The legend, stripped of any humanity, became a curiosity that confirmed the stereotypes of the age. What made these images so powerful and so damaging was the ease with which they turned living people into characters in a grotesque story. The children depicted were not portrayed as individuals with families, hopes, or futures. They were drawn as props, figures whose only role was to stand at the edge of danger while the audience chuckled from a safe distance. By presenting this legend as light-hearted amusement, the newspapers and postcard sellers helped to normalize the idea that certain lives were less valuable, that the suffering of some could be turned into a casual joke. In doing, they carried forward the deeper prejudices of a society that had only recently emerged from the era of legal enslavement and was now enforcing segregation through laws and unwritten codes of exclusion. This trade in imagery was not confined to the American South. Postcards bearing these cruel jokes were mailed across the country and even overseas, becoming part of an international fascination with the supposed wildness of the Florida swamps. Collectors prized them as novelties, and newspapers reprinted the stories as though they were simple curiosities. Each time the tale was retold, the legend grew stronger, and the distance between the horror of the story and the casual amusement of the audience widened. What might once have been recognized as a shocking rumor became, through repetition, a normalized piece of popular culture. Historians today debate whether hunters ever truly used children in such a way, and many find little evidence of the practice itself. But the postcards and newspaper clippings remain undeniable artifacts of a different, equally troubling reality, a time when society found it acceptable to laugh at such a story, to turn the imagined suffering of black children into a source of entertainment. Even if the events described were more legend than fact, the willingness to circulate and enjoy these images reveals a truth about the values of the age. The legend's persistence said less about the actual dangers of the swamp than about the attitudes of those who bought and shared the cards, reinforcing a hierarchy in which some lives could be reduced to symbols for the amusement of others. As decades passed, the images became part of a larger cultural memory, They resurfaced occasionally in collections of Americana or in the dusty boxes of antique dealers. Their captions still capable of shocking modern eyes. For many who encounter them today, the postcards and clippings serve as an unsettling reminder of how easily prejudice can masquerade as entertainment, and how the printed page can carry cruelty as effectively as any weapon. They show that the legend of Gator Bait, whether rooted in fact or folklore, gained its enduring power not from hunters in the marsh but from the publishers and audiences who kept the story alive. This chapter of the tale binds together the swamp and the city, the hunter and the spectator, the danger of the alligator and the far subtler danger of indifference. It connects the perilous trade in alligator skins to the University of Florida's decision, over a century later, to retire a cheer whose words unwittingly echoed that same legend. For it was not only the hunters who profited from the alligator's mystique, but also the printers, writers, and collectors who turned the imagined suffering of children into a spectacle. And it is this legacy of a society that once laughed at what should have provoked compassion that lingers most powerfully when we examine the postcards and clippings today. They remain as fragile, yellowed witnesses to a time when the legend of Gator Bait left the swamps and entered the bloodstream of popular culture, ensuring that the echoes of the past would continue to ripple through the present. The cruel whispers that began in the shadowed swamps and spread through newspapers and postcards did not stop at the edges of parlors or the hands of collectors. They seeped further, slipping quietly into the everyday culture of childhood itself, where the impressions formed in youth often shape the way people see the world for a lifetime. By the early years of the 20th century, the legend of Gator Bait had traveled beyond the columns of sensational journalism and the garish ink of souvenir cards, finding its way into the stories, songs, and poems that children heard before they even understood the power of words. What had started as a dark rumor about hunters luring alligators had become a rhyme to recite. A picture in a nursery book, a line in a song meant to amuse. And with each repetition, the story shed another layer of shock until it felt like nothing more than a bit of folk wisdom, a strange curiosity from a faraway swamp, while quietly shaping the hearts and minds of those who absorbed it, in schoolyards and front parlors, in the gentle rhythm of bedtime routines. The tale became part of the background music of childhood. The poems came wrapped in sing-song cadences, easy for young voices to remember, while the songs carried catchy refrains that could be hummed without a second thought. Illustrations in children's books depicted swampy scenes with wide-eyed alligators and caricatured figures at the water's edge, turning a narrative born of cruelty into something that seemed playful, even charming. The children who encountered these works often had no reason to question their meaning. To them, the story of Gator Bait was simply another bit of the natural world, like the call of a whippoorwill or the rustle of reeds in the breeze. Yet the message woven between the rhymes and pictures was anything but harmless. Through the gentle disguise of entertainment, the legend carried a hidden lesson about the value of human life and the boundaries of belonging. The figures in the poems and pictures were not portrayed as children with names and families, but as nameless characters defined only by their role in a dangerous game. The songs rarely expressed fear or sympathy. Instead, they invited laughter or a thrill of danger, subtly suggesting that the peril faced by these children was amusing rather than tragic. For young white audiences, these repeated images and phrases quietly taught that some lives could be treated as less than fully human, that the suffering of others could be turned into a story for their amusement. Prejudice did not arrive with a lecture or a law. It came in the form of a catchy tune or a bedtime rhyme, absorbed without question and carried forward into adulthood. This process of normalization was powerful precisely because it was so unremarkable. Parents who passed along the songs or bought the books often did so without malice, simply sharing what their own parents had once shared with them. Publishers reprinted the poems and illustrations because they sold well, not because they intended to cultivate hatred. Yet the effect was the same. By cloaking cruelty in the innocent trappings of children's culture, society planted seeds of bias that would grow quietly, shaping attitudes long after the songs were forgotten. The young voices who once giggled at the rhymes would become the adults who saw the world through the lens of those early lessons, carrying into the next generation the idea that some people could be reduced to characters in a dangerous myth. Historians looking back on this era find in these songs and books a revealing portrait of how prejudice sustains itself. Legal systems and social codes can enforce segregation and discrimination, but it is in the stories told to children that such ideas take root most deeply. The gator bait trope shows how a society can pass down its fears and hierarchies not through formal teaching but through the very entertainments that are supposed to delight the young. Even those who never set foot in the swamp or heard the hiss of an alligator absorbed a vision of the world in which the suffering of black children could be trivialized, their humanity set aside in favor of a thrilling or humorous tale. The echoes of these childhood lessons were not confined to the past. When the University of Florida faced its reckoning in 2020 and chose to retire the gator bait cheer, it was responding not only to the legend's origins in the dangerous world of alligator hunters, but also to the long cultural journey that had kept the phrase alive. The chant, innocent in intention, carried within it the faint but undeniable resonance of those songs and stories, of the postcards and poems that had once made a dark myth part of everyday life. By choosing to acknowledge the weight of that history, the university was doing more than ending a game day tradition. It was breaking the quiet chain of transmission that had begun in nursery rhymes and bedtime stories more than a century earlier. To trace the path of the gator bait tale from the swamp to the schoolyard, from sensational newspapers to the pages of children's books, is to see how culture itself can become the most powerful teacher of all. The legend endured not because hunters continued the practice, but because society continued the story, dressing it in the soft colors of childhood until its cruelty was almost invisible. And in confronting that legacy today, we are reminded that the stories we tell our children, whether in song, in poetry, or in picture books, carry the power to shape how they will see others for the rest of their lives. It is a truth as old as the swamps themselves. The most lasting lessons are often those we hardly notice we are learning, whispered like a lullaby, yet echoing long after the music fades. The legend of gator bait, woven through songs, postcards, and children's rhymes, did not arise in isolation. It was born in a time when the very structure of American society was being reshaped in the aftermath of the Civil War. When the promises of freedom and equality written into the nation's constitution were undermined by a network of laws and practices designed to keep black Americans at the bottom of a rigid social order. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were an era of uneasy transition. Slavery had officially ended, but a different kind of bondage emerged, one that was enforced not by chains but by statutes, customs, and terror. The stories of alligator baiting, whether literal truth or dark folklore, reflected the atmosphere of a society that was determined to deny full humanity to an entire race of people, and to pass that denial from one generation to the next. After the guns of the Civil War fell silent, a brief period of hope seemed possible. The Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th promised freedom, citizenship, and voting rights to formerly enslaved people. For a moment it looked as though the nation might finally honor its founding ideals. But as federal troops withdrew and political will faded, Southern states moved quickly to reassert control. They crafted the Black Codes, laws that restricted movement, limited employment opportunities, and imposed harsh penalties for minor infractions. These measures were designed to recreate as much of the old slave system as possible without openly defying the new constitutional amendments. Freed men and women who had dreamed of owning land or building businesses found themselves trapped once again in cycles of dependency and exploitation. When these codes were challenged, the reaction hardened. By the 1870s and 1880s, The Black Codes evolved into the Jim Crow system, complex web of state and local laws that enforced segregation in every aspect of public life. Schools, transportation, restaurants, and even public parks were divided by race, with the clear message that black citizens were to remain second class. Voting rights were stripped away through poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, while acts of intimidation from economic reprisals to mob violence ensured that those who resisted paid a heavy price. This was not merely a matter of prejudice in private hearts. It was a calculated political and social order designed to keep power in the hands of those who had held it before the war. Within this environment, the gator bait stories found fertile ground. Myths thrive where fear and inequality are strongest, and the tales of black children used as lures for alligators served as a grim metaphor for the way society regarded black life. Disposable, commodified, and stripped of agency. Whether every detail of the legend was fact or exaggeration mattered less than the message it carried. These stories mirrored the real experiences of people who lived under the constant threat of humiliation and violence. Lynching was not merely a word in the newspaper. It was a public spectacle, a warning to anyone who dared to challenge the order. Families could lose a loved one overnight without hope of justice. The line between rumor and reality blurred, because life itself was dangerous for those whose rights existed only on paper. It is no accident that newspapers, postcards, and popular songs of the time so easily portrayed black children as figures of mockery or danger. In a society built on Jim Crow's foundation, such images reassured white audiences that the hierarchy was natural and inevitable. They turned suffering into entertainment, making the unequal order seem almost playful. A nursery rhyme about gator bait might appear harmless, but it carried within it the same logic as the laws that denied black men the vote and the mobs that terrorized black families. It taught children that some lives were worth less, that cruelty could be a joke, and that the world's dangers belonged to others, not to them. The violence of the era was not confined to hidden corners. Parades celebrated the old Confederate cause, and monuments rose to honor those who had fought to preserve slavery. Night riders of the Ku Klux Klan burned homes and churches, while local sheriffs looked the other way or even joined in. Each act of intimidation reinforced the lesson that legal rights meant little without power to defend them. Within this reality, a legend like gator bait could feel not only possible but emblematic. Another reminder that black lives could be threatened or taken without consequence. Understanding this context reveals why the legend endured and why echoes of it remained even in something as seemingly light-hearted as a college football cheer more than a century later. The stories of gator bait were never just about hunters and alligators. They were about a society that normalized the dehumanization of black people, using both law and culture to maintain control. The same society that passed Jim Crow laws also created the songs and postcards, the jokes and rhymes that made cruelty seem ordinary. Today, when institutions like the University of Florida take steps to retire traditions linked to such painful histories, they are not simply reacting to a single story or image. They are acknowledging the long shadow of the Jim Crow era, when myths and laws worked hand in hand to shape the nation's conscience. The legend of gator bait may remain partly unprovable as literal fact, but it is undeniably true as a reflection of the world that produced it, a world where injustice was codified and cruelty was entertainment. To remember this is to confront the deeper truth that the stories a society tells, whether in law books or in lullabies, reveal the values it chooses to pass on. Only by facing those stories, however disturbing, can we begin to ensure that their lessons are never repeated. Historians who have spent years studying the cultural landscape of the late 19th and early 20th centuries often remind us that the legend of gator bait, for all its haunting power, straddles an uneasy line between fact and folklore. The postcards, songs, and children's rhymes were undeniably real. They existed as tangible artifacts, paper and ink that gleefully repeated the phrase and cemented a cruel stereotype in the public imagination. Yet when these scholars search for clear, verifiable evidence that black children were routinely used as actual bait for hunters' alligators, the historical record becomes far more elusive. Newspaper clippings and second-hand accounts flicker at the edges of credibility, their details often sensational and their motives sometimes questionable. In the world of Jim Crow America, where violence and spectacle often went hand in hand, the boundary between reality and exaggeration was porous, and myths could spread with the speed of rumor. This ambiguity does not lessen the pain the stories inflicted. On the contrary, it reveals a different kind of cruelty, the willingness of a society to create and circulate an image so dehumanizing that it did not matter whether it was literally true. The legend's very persistence shows how deeply it resonated with an audience eager to maintain a racial hierarchy. Whether or not the act was commonplace, the suggestion itself served a purpose. It painted black children not as cherished human beings but as disposable, transforming them into characters in a grotesque narrative designed to entertain and to warn. By turning people into symbols of fear or amusement, the tale achieved what laws and violence also sought to do: reinforce the idea that some lives could be treated as less than fully human. Researchers have traced how such myths often begin as whispers and grow into accepted truths when repeated often enough. A sensational headline, a traveling showman's yarn, or a single shocking anecdote could, in a matter of years, be retold as common knowledge. At a time when newspapers competed fiercely for attention, and when racial caricature was profitable entertainment, even a kernel of a story could swell into legend. The absence of proof did not restrain imagination. It invited it. Stories of alligators drawn to children's cries or of hunters using human bait took on the authority of folklore, shaping public perceptions long after any eyewitnesses were gone. Yet to dwell only on the question of literal accuracy is to risk missing the larger meaning. Whether every incident described actually occurred is less important than what the myth revealed about the culture that embraced it. The same society that enforced Jim Crow laws and celebrated Confederate nostalgia also delighted in grotesque humor and cruel fables. These tales, embroidered or invented, functioned as another form of control. They were cautionary lessons, told and retold in parlors and on porches, that reinforced the imagined natural order in which white dominance remained unquestioned. Children who grew up hearing these rhymes learned their lesson well, absorbing prejudice before they could fully understand it. The legend's endurance also speaks to how trauma and terror were communicated in the black community. For many African Americans living under the constant threat of violence, the possibility that such stories might be true was itself a source of fear, a reminder that life could be taken or demeaned without warning. Whether the tale began as a grotesque exaggeration or a single shocking crime, its meaning to those who heard it was the same. Danger was everywhere, and the devaluation of black life was not a myth but a daily reality. The story's power lay not in its factual certainty, but in the undeniable truth of the world. It described a world where lynching was a public spectacle, where legal rights offered little protection, and where cruelty was both entertainment and enforcement. Even today, historians caution against treating the absence of conclusive evidence as a reason to dismiss the legend entirely. Folklore often carries truths that official records overlook. People who were marginalized and terrorized rarely had the power to document their own experiences in ways that later generations could verify. Silence in the archives can be the result of suppression, fear, or simply the erasure of voices that were never deemed worthy of record. To approach the gator bait story with care is not to endorse it uncritically but to acknowledge that history is often told from incomplete fragments. Modern scholars, educators, and activists who revisit this story are not seeking to sensationalize it again but to confront the values that allowed it to flourish. By examining both the artifacts and the doubts, they reveal how easily a society can create myths to justify injustice. They show that cruelty need not be literal to be real, and that the cultural damage of a lie can linger long after its factual basis fades. In this sense, the debate over whether children were actually used as bait is less a matter of historical trivia than a lesson in how prejudice is transmitted through law, through custom, and through the stories a community chooses to tell. When we listen to these historians, we are reminded that history is rarely a simple ledger of proven events. It is also the record of fears, fantasies, and beliefs that shaped human behavior. The gator bait legend, with its mix of real artifacts and uncertain truth, forces us to confront how a society's imagination can be as dangerous as its actions. It challenges us to recognize that even when a story cannot be fully proven, the mindset that created it and the harm it caused remains a historical fact. Only by grappling with this complexity can we begin to understand the enduring shadow of that era and guard against the repetition of its cruelties in new forms. In the economic reality of the American South, even before the Civil War ended and for decades after, the harsh calculus of slavery and its lingering legacy meant that every person held in bondage, especially children, was measured not just by their humanity, but by their price. Enslaved children were seen as future laborers, their lives turned into columns of numbers in a ledger where their worth was calculated in dollars and cents. Farmers, plantation owners, and traders understood their value as an investment. And this cold financial logic made it profoundly irrational for anyone to risk those lives in a dangerous swamp for the sake of catching a wild alligator. And yet, even with this undeniable truth, the story of gator bait found fertile ground. The legend of children used as lures for alligators persisted, passed down in whispers and printed in newspapers, not because it made economic sense, but because it reflected something deeper and more insidious about the society that nurtured it. The very fact that such a tale could be believed speaks volumes about the climate of racial cruelty that defined the era. The South was a place where laws and customs worked in concert to strip black men, women, and children of dignity and rights. Jim Crow statutes codified segregation, and the black codes of the Reconstruction period sought to control every aspect of African American life. Violence, both spontaneous and orchestrated, enforced this social order. Public lynchings and the constant threat of retribution for even imagined offenses kept black communities in a state of fear. Within such an environment, it was tragically easy for the wider society to imagine atrocities, even those that defied logic. The cruelty was so pervasive that stories of unimaginable acts, whether true or not, fit all too neatly into the accepted narrative of white supremacy. This tension between economic reality and cultural perception highlights the way myth can thrive even when it contradicts fact. Hunters and traders would never have risked a commodity as valuable as a child in such a dangerous way. Yet the legend of gator bait required no evidence to take root. The image of black children at the mercy of swamp predators functioned as a metaphor for a society that routinely denied their humanity. To many, it did not matter whether the events ever took place. The story merely confirmed what the dominant culture already believed about the disposability of black life. The myth became a reflection of the moral landscape, where cruelty could be imagined without hesitation, and where such imaginings reinforced the social hierarchy. Historians examining this paradox often point out that legends like this one reveal not the literal practices of the time, but the psychological truths of an oppressive society. The people who repeated the gator bait story were not carefully weighing the economics of human chattel. They were expressing, consciously or unconsciously, a worldview in which black children could be talked about as objects rather than individuals. In songs, postcards, and children's books, the story was told with a flippant cruelty that served to normalize racial inequality. By laughing at the image or passing it along as entertainment, white audiences reaffirmed their own sense of dominance. This willingness to believe the unbelievable also speaks to the way fear and hatred can distort common sense. When prejudice is ingrained, it can override logic, making even the most implausible narratives seem possible. In a culture steeped in racial violence, The economic argument against such acts was not enough to dispel the tale. The myth of gator bait endured precisely because it resonated with the fears and fantasies of the time. It became part of the larger folklore of white supremacy. A story that needed no proof because it satisfied a cultural hunger to dehumanize and degrade. For black families who lived through these decades, the legend carried a different weight. Whether or not they believed every detail, the very fact that such a story could circulate was a reminder of their vulnerability. It confirmed what they already knew from experience, that their lives were undervalued and their safety precarious. To them, the tale was not just a grotesque rumor. It was a symbol of the ever-present threat that their children could be treated as less than human, even if no hunter had ever actually used a child as bait. The society around them had already proven capable of unimaginable cruelty. The story's persistence into the 20th century, long after slavery's formal end, underscores how racial stereotypes outlived the institution that gave birth to them. Though the law no longer sanctioned ownership of human beings, the cultural habits of dehumanization continued. Myths like gator bait kept those habits alive, reinforcing the old hierarchies in the minds of both black and white communities. The economic logic that should have rendered the story impossible was powerless against the emotional logic of racism, which thrived on fear, spectacle, and the reduction of human beings to symbols. By revisiting this history today, scholars and storytellers do more than debunk a legend. They expose the mechanisms by which cruelty sustains itself, even in the face of contradictory evidence. The gator bait myth is less about what hunters actually did in the swamps and more about what a society was willing to imagine. It teaches us that the power of a story lies not only in its factual accuracy, but in the beliefs it reflects and the harm it can inflict. The economic irrationality of risking the lives of enslaved children should have been obvious. But the persistence of the legend reveals how deeply racial prejudice shaped the collective imagination. Understanding this paradox invites us to confront uncomfortable truths about the past. It challenges us to see that the damage caused by such myths is real, even when the events themselves cannot be proven. It reminds us that cruelty can be cultural as well as physical, and that the stories a society tells, no matter how implausible, can leave wounds that last for generations. By facing these narratives honestly, we can begin to reckon with the enduring impact of the prejudices that gave them life and ensure that their power to dehumanize is not passed on to the future. Whether the gator bait story unfolded as literal truth or grew from the fertile soil of folklore, its endurance tells us something far more important than the details of any single event. It speaks to the atmosphere of dehumanization and terror that surrounded black communities in the decades after emancipation. An environment where cruelty was not simply a possibility but a constant companion. The legend did not arise in a vacuum. It belonged to an era when the promises of freedom were met with backlash, when the collapse of slavery did not end oppression but merely transformed it. Reconstruction's fragile gains were quickly rolled back by black codes and Jim Crow laws, and the machinery of white supremacy adapted to the times, enforcing racial hierarchy through intimidation, violence, and an ever-present fear that even the most basic rights could be stripped away without warning. In such a society, myths like the gator bait narrative served as more than stories. They were tools of psychological warfare. Whether or not hunters ever placed children near the water's edge, the very suggestion that such a thing could happen carried a chilling message. That black lives were so undervalued that even a child's safety was disposable. This was terror not only in physical form but in the imagination, a constant reminder of vulnerability. Parents already living with the threat of lynching or the whims of local lawmen did not need to see the act to feel the fear. The possibility was enough, because it fit perfectly into a world that had already proven itself capable of brutality. The power of this legend lay in its ability to capture and reinforce the cultural mindset of the time. Newspapers printed caricatures and crude jokes. Postcards circulated with grotesque images. Songs and children's rhymes repeated the story as if it were harmless entertainment. Each repetition turned the myth into a kind of social currency. normalizing the idea that black children could be reduced to symbols of danger or mockery. It was not necessary for every listener to believe the story literally. What mattered was that the narrative echoed and amplified the prejudice already woven into everyday life. In the parlors of white families and the playgrounds where children sang cruel rhymes, the tale became part of a shared vocabulary of supremacy. For black communities, the legend carried a different weight entirely. It was not a story to laugh at but a warning, another shadow in a landscape already dark with threats. Even if the details were exaggerated or invented, the fear it invoked was real. Families who had lived through the auction block or witnessed neighbors dragged from their homes knew that the line between rumor and reality could be perilously thin. They understood that a society capable of turning human beings into property would find no moral boundary in turning children into characters in a nightmare. The story's grip on the imagination was itself a form of violence, inflicting harm not through action but through the steady erosion of security and dignity. Historians and cultural scholars who examine the gator bait narrative today emphasize that its significance lies less in proving or disproving specific incidents, and more in what it reveals about the culture that embraced it. Myths often outlive the events they supposedly describe because they capture a deeper truth about the fears and desires of a community. In this case, the deeper truth was the enduring belief that black lives were expendable, that their suffering could be entertainment, and that their humanity could be denied without consequence. The story was both a symptom and a mechanism of that belief, a way of keeping racial hierarchies alive not only through laws and violence but through imagination itself. This is why the legend has persisted even into modern times. Long after the swamps of Florida and Louisiana ceased to be centers of alligator hunting, and long after Jim Crow's most explicit statutes were dismantled, the tale continues to surface in conversations about race and memory because it captures something essential about how prejudice operates. It shows that terror is not only about physical acts, it is also about the stories a society tells to justify and perpetuate inequality. Myths like this one become part of the cultural fabric, shaping perceptions long after their origins are forgotten, reminding us that cruelty can be passed down not just through actions but through words and images. To confront this story today is to confront more than a single ugly rumor. It is to acknowledge a history in which violence was both a fact and a metaphor, and in which the imagination of the dominant culture could be as wounding as any weapon. The gator bait narrative forces us to recognize how terror can be maintained without a single documented act, how the mere possibility of dehumanization can inflict its own lasting scars. It invites us to see that even if no child was ever used to lure an alligator, the people who repeated the story, who printed it, sang it, and passed it along were participating in a larger system that treated black lives as less than fully human. By exploring this legend with honesty and care, we gain more than a historical footnote. We gain a clearer understanding of how myths can sustain oppression and how memory itself can be a battleground. Whether literal or myth, the gator bait story stands as a testament to the power of narrative to shape reality, to wound and to warn, and to remind us that the struggle for human dignity has always been fought not only in courts and legislatures, but also in the realm of imagination. To remember it is not to give the myth power, but to take it back, to ensure that its legacy serves as a lesson rather than a lingering threat, and to affirm that no community should ever again live under the shadow of such dehumanizing tales. To bring this journey to a close, we must pause and recognize that confronting a story like the gator bait legend is about far more than cataloging an unsettling piece of folklore. It is about understanding how societies pass down beliefs, how myths and half-truths can be used to justify cruelty, and how the echoes of those myths continue to shape the present. Whether every detail of the legend was ever literally true matters less than the fact that it reflected the harsh climate of racial prejudice and fear that defined so much of American life after slavery. By daring to look closely at this painful history, we uncover not only what people once did or imagined, but also how a culture can normalize injustice when it is left unchallenged. Remembering this past is not about reopening old wounds for the sake of shock or spectacle. It is about understanding the forces that allowed those wounds to form in the first place. The story of gator bait shows us that racism is not just a matter of individual hatred, but of systems, laws, customs, and cultural messages that can strip entire communities of their humanity. If we turn away from these lessons because they are uncomfortable, we risk letting those same patterns re-emerge in new forms. Confronting them, on the other hand, gives us the chance to break the cycle, to name the prejudices that once went unspoken, and to ensure that the values of dignity and equality are more than just words on paper. This is why historians, educators, and community leaders continue to tell these stories. They remind us that history is not a fixed record locked away in archives. It is a living conversation about who we are and who we want to become. By facing the myths and the truths of the past, we take away their power to harm and instead use them to build understanding and empathy. We learn that systemic racism is not only a relic of the 19th or 20th century, but a challenge that demands vigilance in every generation. As you reflect on what you have heard, consider how the past still speaks to our present. The legend of gator bait is more than a disturbing anecdote. It is a cautionary tale about the danger of letting stereotypes and fear guide our imagination. It calls on each of us to reject dehumanizing narratives wherever we encounter them and to stand for a society where every child, every person, is recognized for their full humanity. Remembering is not enough, we must also act, whether by challenging injustice in our own communities, supporting education that tells the whole story, or simply by keeping these conversations alive. Thank you for taking the time to listen and to walk through this difficult history. Your willingness to learn and to bear witness is what keeps these lessons alive and meaningful. If this story has moved you, if it has deepened your understanding of the struggles that continue today, please show your support, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you can join us as we explore more untold chapters of our shared past. Together, we can honor those whose experiences were too often silenced and ensure that the attitudes that once gave life to such myths will never take root again.